So no, punching a punching bag is not a good way of dealing with your anger, and here's why. This is a response to another post where people had tons of questions, and I'm doing a series. So psychologists have a word for this, and it's called catharsis. It's the idea that letting off steam is a good way to vent our anger. Amongst anger researchers, though, we call it the Catharsis Myth because we know it doesn't work. Now, as a concept, it dates back to Aristotle, but in psychology, it's rooted in the work of a guy you may have heard of, Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud was wrong about most things, and this is one of them. He's got this thing called the hydraulic model of anger. He says we're like pressure cookers, and if we don't vent off steam, we explode. As it turns out, human beings are more complicated than kitchen products. It's not just that venting doesn't help, it actually hurts. And I'm going to explain all of that in the next few videos. How do we know that Freud was super wrong about venting? Because after he pitched it, researchers did the work. Science 1, creepy old philosopher 0. And the first of these was a study by R.H. Hornberger in 1959. So Hornberger had one of his research assistants pretend to be a participant and insult the other participants. Psychologists used to be super mean. Afterwards, those participants were assigned to either pound nails or do nothing. And when they were done, they were given the opportunity to criticize the person who had criticized them. Now, if catharsis worked, the nail pounding group should have worked that anger out. They should have let off that steam. Now, did that happen? Of course not. In fact, the opposite happened. They were more critical and more angry. So here's more on why it doesn't work for you to blow off steam. So after all this research is done, in 1973, a super famous social psychologist named Albert Bandura says, we gotta knock this off. He says, catharsis just doesn't work. Now, you might not know the name, but you're probably familiar with this study right here. These are the very famous Bobadil studies. They taught us a ton about learning, modeling, and aggression. And this seems like a good time to brag about how I once had dinner with Albert Bandura. He ordered a charcuterie tray. I had already had dinner, but I ordered something else just to keep it from being weird. And then in 1977, this book chapter comes out and it's a super thorough review. Like Bandura said, look, this doesn't work. We gotta stop. Have we stopped? Nope. We've doubled down. We've made it worse. More coming. Stay tuned. Right, so here's my favorite study on why catharsis doesn't work. And it's a study from Dr. Brad Bushman and his team in 1999. There were about 700 participants randomly assigned to one of two groups. One group read an article that said venting worked. The other read an article that said it didn't work. Participants were then provoked. They had their writing insulted by another participant. Then they were assigned to punch a punching bag or do nothing. So this literally directly applies to the question that started all this. And when they were done, they competed with that same participant, and if they won, they got to punish them. They got to blast them with this really aversive noise. He played it for me over the phone once. It's awful. So the group that should be the least angry is the group that read the article saying it should work and got to punch a punching bag. Were they? No. They were the most angry and aggressive. All right, so a lot of people come at me with, but I feel so good after I punch stuff. How can it be bad for me? I get it. It sounds counterintuitive. Right up until the point that you start thinking about how a lot of things feel good when you're emotional. And those things aren't always good for you or those around you. I feel good when I eat a whole tub of ice cream. I don't smoke, but a lot of people tell me it feels good when they're stressed or emotional. I do drink, and you know what? It feels good when I'm stressed and emotional. But we know those things have long-term consequences. Those aren't good coping strategies, even though they feel good. So a lot of people said, but exercising when you're angry is good, right? I'm sorry. No, I want to say clearly, for the record, so everybody hears it, I believe in exercising as a form of emotional regulation. It is a critical foundation of emotional well-being. But the key word here is when you are angry. I try to keep finger quotes to a minimum. Sometimes I fail. This is actually another form of catharsis. And the reason is because it keeps you physiologically aroused at a time when what you need to do is decrease that arousal. It would be like in the middle of a panic attack when you're trying to de-escalate saying, I'm gonna go for a run. There's also this thing called excitation transfer that I'm gonna talk about in a second. So a bunch of people are gonna come at me over the exercise thing. Here's my evidence. In 1972, Zillman and colleagues did a study. I know it's super old, but it's not like human beings would respond differently now. What it really means is we've known this for almost 50 years. So like every study on anger from the 1970s, they provoked their participants first. A lot of our rules on ethics didn't come out until the late 70s. When they were done, they did one of two tasks. They rode an exercise bike, or they did this weird little task where they threaded nickel-sized discs with off-center holes. Then they got to respond to the person who provoked them, and if exercise worked, they'd be less aggressive. But they weren't. They were more aggressive. I still haven't talked about excitation transfer, but I'm going to in a second, I promise. Okay, so here's more evidence on why exercising when angry isn't good for you. Okay, so the key word here again is the when you are angry, because exercising is normally great for your emotional well-being. So there are two words you need to know, and I've been hinting at them a bunch. Excitation transfer. This is the scientific finding that emotions are intensified by arousal not associated with them. In other words, if you're angry and you go for a run, your heart rate will increase. And your brain will think that's because you're angry. We see this happen all the time, and it's not just with anger. This is actually why people say don't start romantic relationships in stressful situations, because you misinterpret that arousal as attraction. and you end up thinking you like someone that you don't actually like. There's a really interesting bridge experiment about this that I'll talk about later.